I have good news and bad news. The good news is you get to pull out your phone. No? Yeah, that we got it. There's a little technology trick called putting it on that makes a big difference. So what you should do is scan the QR code, and I'm going to ask you a very simple question. I'll explain that question in just a second. But I sort of feel funny because today's talk is about a different kind of data. We're not going to talk about machine learning. We're not going to talk about artificial intelligence. We're going to talk about the intelligence we all have. And the question is, how do consumers think about carbon emissions? So the question is not going to be anything about modeling. We're going to use small as opposed to big data. But there's a very simple question, which is how do people think about emissions when it comes time to behave, to buy, and to invest? And that's the question we're going to look at today. And along with a set of colleagues who've been looking at this now, and the questions you're going to see are exactly that. So basically, along with my colleagues who are listed here, we've been asking lots of people to actually estimate what the impact of their emission behavior is. What is the impact of firms on environmental outputs? Particularly, I'm going to use the word carbon a lot. I really mean carbon equivalents throughout. And what we're going to do is basically ask people the same question I'm asking you. Let me imagine that you have a friend. His name or her name is Harry. And Harry actually has a carbon footprint. Harry's footprint, like the average American, turns out is, maybe you all know this, but best guess would be it's about 14 metric tons a year. That's average for Americans. New Yorkers are less because we have this marvelous public transportation system. We're in a dense environment. At the same time, some of us, at least me, are guiltier because I fly a lot. And the question is, in making those decisions, how do I affect that footprint, or what I'll often call the carbon budget? So Harry basically says, I'm doing 14. For some reason, I want to cut that in half to 7. So the question I'm going to ask you is, what should Harry do? And we have 2 questions in that. First is, how much do you think you know? And then there's going to be a drag and drop. You can use your thumb. It's sort of like a vertical. It's like a vertical. Is that better? Okay. It's like a vertical. I tend to walk around, so forgive me. It's going to be sort of like a vertical Tinder. Basically, put the things that you think are most effective at the top and least effective at the bottom. So do you all see that on your screen? I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. And if the technology gods agree, we're going to have your results. In fact, if you're done, you'll get one source of feedback, which is how well you did. Okay, I'll give you another 30 seconds for that. Yes. Oh, okay. Okay, so that's why. You could hear me but not see me. That's fine. I think it's better if you hear me but not see me, but that's okay. Okay. So basically, the question is, what should Harry do? What should you tell Harry? And here, just to be clear, we're talking about emissions only. And so there's the QR code if anyone missed it, but let me go on. So one of the things that's a big belief in most discussions of climate change is those consumers who want to change things will. So you've seen amazing changes in public opinion. This is a tracking survey done at Yale every year, and 18% in 2017 were alarmed. That's now 33%. Now, if I'm a marketing manager, having a segment of 33% of all Americans who are alarmed, that's a really good opportunity, right? Alarmed is really a strong feeling. So, and you also see papers that say things like research. Actually, consumers buy sustainable products. That sounds like it's a nice recipe, right? Concern plus action. Here's the question. Do people really know how to turn their concern into action? I'm going to argue there's reasons to suspect they don't. First thing is, there's a confusion between sustainability and carbon emissions. A product can well be labeled sustainable without necessarily actually having much of an impact on carbon emissions. That disconnect could be important. It often involves decisions in production that aren't observable. I do a Google search. I don't see whether the electricity powering that search is green electricity or maybe terrible electricity. The other thing is really quite subtle, but carbon emissions are typically invisible. Imagine they were purple instead of clear. You would actually be able to track them, but now you can't. They're invisible, they're odorless, and finally, the consequences are delayed in time. carbon that's emitted now has an effect over a long period of time, and geographically distanced. The carbon I emit today might well affect something that happens in Africa in 30 years. So I think that connection is not obvious. And so what we've been doing is actually trying to understand what do people know about their actual behaviors. Let's talk about Harry again. So we picked behaviors that we think are very different in their impact, and we were right. So it turns out if you reduce your waste, sometimes called recycling, you reduce your emissions by 1/10 of a ton. Half your meat consumption produces a half-ton reduction in your carbon budget. One less flight, almost 1 ton reduction. Reduce your electricity usage, almost 2 tons reduction. Live car-free, an option many of us New Yorkers might have, about 3 tons. And almost by definition, carbon offsets, if I buy off half of them, and we're believing offsets work here, and I could talk about that later, that's 7 tons. These things order by 2 orders of magnitude. There's a big difference. And deciding which of those you do is going to make a big impact in what happens. So we're going to do this, here's the list. We're going to do this not just for behaviors. I'll talk about those today. We've also done that for firms. What do people's beliefs about firms' carbon footprint in industries? And here's the basic bottom line. If you think about carbon budgets, people are trying to set a budget without necessarily knowing the prices. It's really hard to decide how you're going to spend your carbon when you don't know what the connection is between your behavior and what goes on. Okay, so just to give you an idea of what we've looked at, I'm not going to talk about this much today, but think about industries. These are 7 industries. These are the Scope 1 emissions from Bloomberg Green. And there's 200 times difference between the lowest, which is apparel, footwear, and accessory design, and the highest, which is airlines. Now, we're going to look and not talk about today particular firms. So we'll zoom in, for example, on non-alcoholic beverages. And there we have good data on PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Dr. Pepper, and Monster Beverage. And again, there's big differences in reported, and I have to emphasize this is reported, Scope 1 emissions. Okay, so a quick methodological note. It's nice working with people who know what they're talking about, and I've been schooled a little bit on the role of Scope 1 emissions and how they're measured. And so basically, we're going to use for behavior what the EPA says and what previous research has shown. For firms and industries, we're going to look at those industries and firms where CDP and Bloomberg agree, and for brands that people know about. So we're not going to talk about obscure soft drinks. We're going to talk about obscure soft drinks that most people will do this. We ask people the simplest questions. We don't ask people, how many tons does Coca-Cola generate? We ask them, who's worse, Coke or Pepsi? We ask what behavior is more important, just like we asked you, recycling or dropping 1 flight. Okay, so it's as easy as you can get. We don't want numbers, we just want a sense of magnitude. We've done now 6 studies. I think I just checked, we're over 2,000 respondents. And for most of these studies, we're using representative samples of the US population. Okay, so how did people do? Kind of interesting. You all saw a number, and that number is essentially a correlation. That correlation, for those of you who remember your statistics, 0 means you don't have a clue. -1 means you're going exactly backwards. But +1 means you got it right. So in the feedback, you probably have a number for yourself, and hopefully we'll have a number for the group in a second. But here's how Americans did. Their average correlation is 0.11. That is, they don't have much of a clue. Now, you might say, oh, there's some good people and some bad people. I think the bad and good people, if you do a statistical test, are just lucky. The average represents a big part of what's going on there. And when you look at the other graph, I want to take 2 seconds to talk about it because I think it's interesting. On the y-axis, sorry to do this to you, but on the bottom axis is what the objective rank is. Okay, so as you could see here, offsets and living car-free are bigger. And on the x-axis is the objective, what people thought is on the y-axis. So let's just walk through this. If we take a look at this and you say, let's take it reducing meat consumption. People give it an average rank of almost 3. In reality, it's number 5. They way overestimate things that are on that side of the line. If they were perfect, everything would be on that line. It would be a perfect regression. They're not. So they overestimate reduced meat consumption. They underestimate other things like purchasing carbon offsets. It's a big effect. And in fact, for carbon offsets, they estimate on average effect by 6 tons. The real effect is 7. They think it only saves 1. So I think people would be very confused if they're using this data to actually, their own beliefs to do this. So the big data is nice, but little data is important and confusing. We thought maybe maybe it's not something the average American do. We're lucky enough to have Columbia Alumni Magazine put this link to this quiz in the magazine. So Columbia alums, they have to be much better, right? No. They, in fact, not only are they now statistically significant, they're a little bit worse, but they show exactly the same pattern. Notice, again, meat consumption is overestimated, offsets are underestimated. There is really big differences here, and they prove that. So you might be saying, okay, you're showing us people are stupid. Can anyone do this task? So I don't say, A, people are stupid. They're doing the best they can given the information they have. But B, it turns out we were able to ask experts, and we've been very interested in seeing what you do, but we're going to ask experts, can they do this task? So we approached a not-for-profit who we are friends with called RARE. Some of you know they're an internet conservation group that actually has a behavior change component, and they can do it. 60% of them are getting 6 or 7 out of the things ordered right. There's a big difference. They do it well. We're currently have a bunch of climate scientists who are doing this questionnaire. I think this is doable. It's just not doable with what people know. You might be thinking about industries and firms. I'm not going to have the time to do too much on that, but here's industries. People are a little bit better. Their tau is 0.22, but they're still getting things wrong. They think, in fact, that things like non-alcoholic beverages and personal home care products are much better than they really are. And they're overestimating the impact of apparel, footwear, and accessory design and wireless communications. Again, they're better, but not perfect. And when we look at firms, I'll just give you one little teaser. Zoom in on restaurants. People believe that Chipotle is much better than McDonald's. They have essentially the same carbon footprint. Okay, so if you're deciding where to go and you think carbon footprint should be part of that decision, you're going to get it wrong. Okay, what is going on here? We think this is a phenomena psychologists like myself call attribute substitution. You try and answer a tough question by answering an easy question. It's something that I often do in job interviews, right? When someone asks you a hard question, you answer some other question you know the answer to. And I think people are doing that. So what we try and do is estimate the model that says, what's determining the ranking? This is their actual weight they put on CO2. It's there, but it's barely significant. This is what they put on how difficult it is. So we thought maybe people just don't like to do things, so they'll say that's not effective. There's no relationship between how hard it is to do something and actually what the impact is on their judgments of. What does matter is network. What does the people they see around them do? So if I see other people adopting vegan lifestyles, I think that must be effective. And finally, recommendation. That is, what do we hear about as things we should do? That sounds like great news. All we have to do is teach more. But if you look at most materials for kids, they say things like recycling is great. Recycling is good, but it's only a small part of the problem. Okay, so what to do? Nothing. But nothing is wrong because firms that are doing good, they're actually are going to be at a disadvantage if people can't realize they're doing well. Second thing, we've talked about price. I'm a poor psychologist. I won't comment on carbon pricing. But it obviously would be information. I think it could be done well or badly, but that's interesting. Let me sort of close by saying labeling and disclosure, useful for some consumer goods, but there's room for improvement in choice architecture. This is what you see if you go to Google Flights. And they actually do a nice thing, which they actually list the carbon associated with each of the flights. It could be improved. Choice architecture is a whole science about how we present information to people. I, unfortunately, don't really know what 450 kilograms of CO2e is. That's not a concept that I have well. I guess I now know it because I've done this research. But for most of you in the room, I don't think that's a very meaningful statistic. We could think about other ways of presenting that. And so I think improved choice architecture and room for innovative businesses are worthwhile. I think what I'm going to do now is see how you did. And this is truly without a net. Well, you look a lot like most people. So your average is going to be about 0.1. So it looks like the average American, like the average American. Be interesting to see if those of you who thought you knew really do know. Okay, can we go back to the last slide and I'll say goodbye. I, by the way, have to run a very important family event. My wife is getting a major prize in Philadelphia, and so I'm going to be leaving right after this talk, which is good for her. Unfortunately, I don't get to talk to you. Two of my colleagues are here who will, and Eli and Gita, who are in the back. So at breaks, you should find them, and they'll be there. And I want to thank you for your scarce attention. And I don't think I have any time for any questions. Okay, so thank you very much. That's a book I've written about this. Thanks very much.